Good evening. Welcome to our study series. I'm so glad you've joined us for this evening's session. Pastor Ken McGarry, and I welcome you all to our church. If anyone needs to use the restroom at any point in time, there's one available right through this doorway here. Just go straight ahead, and it's accessible to all. Last week, we gathered and learned a little bit about the story of how slavery existed in our community here and was practiced by some of the leading citizens of not only Stoneham, but throughout towns in New England. And it really wasn't until the 1750s or so that attitudes started changing concerning slavery, from it being an accepted practice to something that was an evil to be stamped out. And so tonight you're going to hear more about that story, the transition in people's thinking and how that brought to fruition movements to push for abolition. And so we're going to hear that story tonight. I am very glad to be introducing Ben Jacques, who is going to be leading the way. So thanks again for coming, and I hope you enjoy our evening's session.
Thank you so much for coming. It's good to see faces that we saw the last 2 weeks and a few others. Before I begin, I'd just like to thank the First Congregational Church here for inviting me to be part of the series, and also give our respects to some people that have helped us a lot with research over the years, people within the congregation here, and as well as the Stoneham Historical Society. Joan Quigley's here, and she has helped me with some of my research, and she's done some transcribing of old letters and documents at the Congregational Library. And if you've never visited the Congregational Library on Beacon Hill, look it up online and check it out and go in and take a look. They've just renovated. It's a wonderful organization that is keeping alive the histories of New England, largely through the Congregational churches, which were the descendants of the original Puritan churches in New England. So a ton of history is there, and they've been very helpful to me as well. One other quick comment. 2 weeks ago when I spoke about a slave in the parsonage, talking about slavery within our own town here, it was with a bit of sadness, because I remembered the time that I first read some of the documents and the wills and the notebooks and saw that an individual had been a slave owner and learned the names of the slaves and then collected them and went through old records. Tonight is a little bit different. It's the time when I get to kind of rejoice and say, here's some real heroes in our history of our town, not only this church, but of course all the people in the town and in the other congregations as well. Because we're talking about a time that was extremely volatile, a time when the abolition movement started picking up steam throughout New England. But it wasn't a nice time. It wasn't a time where people just said, oh, we've got to free the slaves down south. And everyone said, yay, let's go do it. It wasn't like that at all. And most of the institutions in New England came out against the early abolitionists, including people in high office, including many in churches and so forth. And there was a lot of trouble in the streets. There were riots. There were people being shouted off the podium. In this town, a man named Timothy Wheeler in 1817, in a fight that happened after an abolitionist lecture in Town Hall, he was stabbed and killed. So it was really a tough time. So I'm going to go through and tell a little bit of that, but the happy part is that we have some real heroes in our town that we can really be proud of. I'll give a little background first. The freedom movement didn't just start in the 19th century. Of course, it started much earlier, including during the period of slavery in this state, which was the period between 1638 when the first slaves arrived here on the ship that had taken Pequot's slaves to the Caribbean. So it was 1638 to 1790 approximately that slavery existed here in Massachusetts. So it was and the freedom movement was trying to give birth and was pushing up at all points. So there's a lot of focus now on Phyllis Wheatley, the slave girl who was bought off the wharves here in Boston when she was about 7 years old and grew up in a household of the Wheatley family that treated her very well in terms of allowing her to get an education, and the other Wheatley children taught her and tutored her. She learned Greek, Latin, read the classics, read the Bible, and became a poet. So this is just a quote from Phyllis Wheatley. In every human breast, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom, and so forth. Abigail Adams. Again, we know that there were people in our colonial society who were in opposition to slavery. People like John and Abigail Adams. So here we have a nice quote from Abigail. Why are we fighting for our freedom when we deny it to others? She's saying. Then, of course, in 1776, with the Declaration of Independence, not only our white ancestors, but our black ancestors here in New England grabbed onto these words. What are you saying? What does this mean now? We create these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal? Well, if I'm a slave in, say, when was this written? 1776 Declaration. These words, I'm listening. My ears are perking right up. So out of the movement in New England, there were two kind of well springs, or seeds rather, that gave birth to the abolition movement in the 1700s and the 18th century. One was the movement for freedom from Britain, breaking away from the tyranny of England. The other was found in the Bible itself. So people were starting to identify. Slaves they knew this right away. They started identifying with the text. They started identifying with the people of Israel, enslaved in Egypt. So slaves who could read, and in the North, the more slaves were likely to be able to learn to read than in the South, where it was prohibited. They started grabbing onto these messages, these themes. So in 1774, Caesar Sartor, a slave up in Newburyport, actually publishes an appeal, and you can read it here. Why are you asking for liberty from England? Give us liberty first, okay? So you can see it's starting to move. Liberty is equally as precious to a black man as it is to a white man, and bondage equally as intolerable to the one as it is to the other. Lemuel Haynes. Well, who was Lemuel Haynes? He was the first African-American minister of the Puritan Church, our ancestor church in the Congregational churches. So he was son of a black man and a white mother, the first ordained African-American minister. Elizabeth Freeman, who's you've probably heard of her, known as Mumbet. She sued for her freedom with a friendly attorney in Sheffield and won her freedom in 1781 based on the newly ratified Massachusetts Constitution. Remember, our Constitution in Massachusetts was written by John Adams and ratified in 1780 before the United States Constitution. So it had much of the language in it that we also find in the Declaration of Independence. And she sues for her freedom, and it's upheld, and 2 years later it goes all the way to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, and they uphold it. So they look at the Constitution, they look at the wording, they agree with her, there's no way that we can, under this Constitution, enslave you. And she and another, several others win their freedom. And so gradually then, freedom in Massachusetts doesn't come by vote. It doesn't come by the legislature. It comes from the courts. So the courts are the one that start, because they start upholding people suing for their own freedom until about 1790. So slavery is kind of petering out from 1780 to 1790 in the turn of the century. So here we have in 1790, the first national census, federal census, ever taken shows that in Massachusetts there were no enslaved people reported. And if you look at the old census from those years, it had a category for slave, for whites, for slaves, for non-whites, and so on. And in Massachusetts, Vermont was the first state to close down slavery. Massachusetts was the second. But note that in 1790, we had been a country now since when? 76? 14 years. There were still slaves in New Hampshire. A lot of people don't realize that. In Rhode Island, there are almost 1,000. In Connecticut, 2,700 slaves. So it didn't happen all at once in New England, and it happened gradually as states and courts would rule in favor of people who were enslaved. So the other thing that we often think of, and I did too, I have to admit, when we think of the great abolitionists in American history, we think of William Lloyd Garrison, right? And many people like that, and that is exactly correct. But we forget that the abolition movement was fueled probably to a major degree by blacks in the South in New England. With the Allies of course were people like William Lloyd Garrison and others. So one of them is Prince Hall. He was born a slave and was freed. He fought at Bunker Hill, as did at least 6 African-American men from Stoneham, some enslaved, 4 of them enslaved. He has quite a career in Boston as an advocate and a petitioner for the rights of African-American people. Here we have some others. David Walker. David Walker published his appeal to the colored citizens of the world. He wasn't just saying Massachusetts, New England, United States. He's saying, colored citizens of the world, we've been dealt a very bad hand. And he writes this great appeal. It caused all kinds of consternation in the southern states. The book was banned. People were afraid that there would be uprisings. So we have David Walker publishes this appeal. Lewis and Harriet Hayden, you can still see their home on Beacon Hill, on the African-American walking tour. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. They were leading citizens in Boston, former slaves, who had come to Boston, created their own business, and then started helping others, and they would help fugitives find work, and they would also, after the Fugitive Slave Act, help them get out of town. There's wonderful stories I don't have time for tonight of how they would help people to escape Boston, go to Concord, go to Fitchburg, go to Leominster, Fitchburg, and Montreal. So that was one of the main routes, and people coming through this area. Okay, a little quiz. How many of these abolitionists can you mention by name? Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison. A little harder, right? How about this guy? John Brown, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. John Brown? Stowe. Okay. So, yeah, Garrison, Grimke. Now, the Grimkes were really important in Boston. They were sisters born on a plantation in the South. I can't remember if it's South Carolina or Georgia. And they were horrified by the treatment, the cruelties to the slaves in their parents' home. They left home as soon as they could. They became Quakers, and they came north and went on speaking tours, major abolitionists. So they would be speaking out in Boston, Worcester, Springfield, Newburyport, wherever they could get an audience. They would show up in churches and they would speak. So John Brown, of course, came to Boston 7 times. Did you know that? I didn't know that. Okay, so all these people were active in Massachusetts at different times. And of course, Harriet Tubman, our great hero. I love this particular picture of her too. Her first trips to Boston, she came several times as well, and she met with abolitionists, raised money. She raised money for John Brown. John Brown called her General Tubman, or General Harriet, called her the General. Of course, she was also called Moses. And if you haven't seen the movie that came out a few years ago called Harriet, please do. It's very well done. I've read biographies of her, and it's a beautiful film. So anyway, so she's coming to Boston. And we have white allies, we call them, people like us, right, who want to be on the side of human rights. Reverend Samuel May, a Unitarian minister. Poet John Greenleaf Whittier. If any of you know his poetry from school? Becky's dad could recite the poem Snowbound, which is about, 20 pages or 10 pages, by heart. He was a major abolitionist and ran a printing press in Philadelphia after he left Haverhill. He comes from Haverhill. And he suffered all kinds of indignities. They burned his press down and would have attacked him if he hadn't fled. He came back dressed as a woman that night and got the printing plates for the next day's edition and saved them and was able to keep the paper going. And Richard Henry Dana, who is he? Anyone read 2 Years Before the Mast besides me? He was a Harvard dropout who got on board a ship that went around the tip of South Africa and up the west coast and collecting hides. They would load up thousands and thousands of hides and come back, which fed the leather industries, the shoemakers of Lynn and Stoneham. But he became an attorney, and he was one of the key attorneys in one of the first fugitive slave arrests in Boston after the Fugitive Slave Act. So he's one of my heroes as well. And the women, of course. Lucy Stone grew up in the Western Mass, and her father was a minister. She was in her church in 1837 when a pastoral letter was written in all the congregations, probably including this one, that said, "Women, sit down, be quiet." Okay? The Grimke sisters had caused such an uproar going around and lecturing against, in the abolition movement, lecturing against slavery, that there was a strong response from the congregational churches that was not the correct role of women. Okay, we'll get to that. Paulina Gary from Stoneham, the major abolitionist figure, the daughter-in-law of Sarah Gary. You see the street, Gary Street? Jerry or Gary, it's actually Gary. Like Gary Mandarin comes from the same thing. So, and Eliza Lee Fallon was the head of the Female Anti-Slavery Society in Boston. So here's just a photo that I found, but I love it because it's a photo of a Quaker abolitionist meeting where women are kind of come together. And Quaker women especially were leaders in both the abolition and suffrage movements. Not only Quakers, Congregationalists, Unitarians, Roman Catholics, if they were here, may have been working on that. But they were denied positions on the planning boards, the men planned the major stuff going on. It was very hard for the women to get a seat on those councils. Okay, so in 1831, now William Lloyd Garrison starts this wonderful, fantastic abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. And it goes all over the country by subscription. But I was interested to note that 2/3 of its subscribers were free and former slaves in Boston. So it's being read by both black and white people here in the area. Okay, let's come to Stoneham. I don't have hard evidence for this, but according to the Stoneham Independent, the first abolitionist meeting was held in the home of Henry and Abigail Green at 10 Bow Street. The house is still there. Lovely people who are there. They gave us a tour, and it's really an amazing thing, right? You know, in our own town. And William Lloyd Garrison attended this meeting. Also, according to this newspaper report, Henry Green, the abolitionist, the descendant of Greens 100 years before who had owned slaves, now he's an abolitionist a century later. He was so worried that ruffians and thugs would attack the house, which they had promised to do if he was going to have an abolitionist meeting, that he kept his rifle beside his chair throughout the whole meeting. So he was going to defend his house. So Lloyd Garrison was there. So we're coming into Stoneham now. A year later, abolitionist meetings in Town Hall, and then you could say, I would like to reserve Town Hall, going to have an abolitionist meeting in 2 weeks, Saturday night, Thursday night, whatever, and you could do it. So abolitionist meetings are disrupted by pro-slavery hecklers who shout them down. We have reports of meetings that they couldn't go on. People started throwing things. In a fight after one meeting, a man is stabbed. I mentioned that earlier, and fatally stabbed, Timothy Wheeler. Then it got so bad that they held a town meeting, a vote, an election. Of course, these are all men. The men vote 62-33 to prohibit any abolitionist meeting or discussion in Town Hall. So that's how bad it had gotten here in our own town. So in the meantime, here we have something else going on. Following public lectures of the Grimke sisters, I mentioned that the Congregational Churches sent out a letter to all the Congregational Churches in Massachusetts, basically saying that the nature of women is to be in the home and to be moral leaders in their families, perhaps even in schools, but never in the church, never in the pulpit. Keep quiet. There was also an objection. The Grimke sisters were telling the horrors that they had witnessed of cruelty to slaves in the South. And the details were so gruesome that the writers of the pastoral letter said, that's going to damage our women, their sensibilities. So the power, and here's a quote, it's a long letter, it has like 14 items in it. In short, women should be quiet, and here's just one quote. The power of woman is in her dependence, flowing from the consciousness of that weakness which God has given her for her protection. Women in Stoneham, they're not happy with this. 14 women in this church send a letter to the male minister and deacons, and they say, we, the undersigned, have been convinced that slavery is an evil of immense magnitude, and being deeply aggrieved that such an utter abomination in the sight of heaven, we entreat you to take such action, notice the word action, as will show plainly that our influence is on the side of justice and humanity. So here we have the women speaking up. We're not going to be silent. If we can't speak out in church, we're going to write letters, we're going to petition, we're going to do what we need to do. Then the next year, 27 women in Stoneham, not all from this church, some from Unitarian Baptists, maybe some not affiliated, they form the local chapter of the Female Anti-Slavery Society. And 27 women in a town that's what? Less than 2,000? So that's a lot of activists, wouldn't you say? in a time when it's really a hostile environment. You have these women going out, and they send to the Liberator, and they said, "Dear friend Garrison, a female anti-slavery society was organized in Stoneham. And here's who we are. Here's our leaders." So you have Sarah Gary, who's the president, vice president, Miss Sally Richardson, corresponding secretary, Miss Mary Newell, recording secretary, Paulina Gary, and so on. So a year later, the men start a chapter. Okay, so the women kind of show them up here. A year later, the men said, "Yeah, we're getting into this too." So they start their own chapter of the Anti-Slavery Society. So the announcement in the Liberator also lamented the death of Sarah Gary, who was its founder. And she was a widow. Her husband had died, and she had raised 3 kids. And the passage in the Liberator said about her, when the slavery subject was first presented, and she saw her society and church tempest-tossed. Okay? It was back and forth, reeling to and fro. She paused and hesitated, but then she looked again and saw it was the cause of God and liberty. She resolved to make the cause of the slave her own. Okay, one of our great heroes in Stoneham. So meanwhile, Massachusetts continues in the 30s to be a haven for fugitive slaves coming up from the South. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, both came from the eastern shore of Maryland. In the 40s, and others are, of course, coming up. So at least 2 families in Stoneham, maybe more, but we know of at least 2. Abijah Bryant and his wife Lavina, and Mary Newhall, and she had a sister in the Newhall family. And this house where Deacon Abijah and Lavina Bryant lived is no longer there. It's about where the Book Oasis is now. But the Newhall house is still there on Green Street, and you can drive by and see it. It just had a new owner this last year, and they were doing all kinds of construction work there. But I'm still hoping to go by and talk to them and say, "Did you know that?" It's a wonderful story. So the 1850, so we go from the 30s when everything's in turmoil, and the period goes on until 1850, and things really heat up. Why? Because of the Fugitive Slave Act, part of the Compromise Bill of 1850, to make a deal with southern states about which states in the West could be slave states and which couldn't. Part of the deal was you guys in the North have to send our slaves back. They did it, they signed it. Even our great Massachusetts senator and orator was part of the agreement. So the Fugitive Slave Act is an act with real teeth. And at this time, you have approximately 2,000 blacks in Boston, both free and fugitive, or free, recently freed, and self-emancipated is the word I like to use, who had come to Boston. And you have posters like this putting up to warn the black residents of Boston, watch out for these guys, they're coming north to get you. Watch out. Stay away from policemen, stay away from agents, people who look like they're agents, they're coming up with warrants. Okay? So then you have in 1850, just a few weeks after the Fugitive Slave Act is passed in Congress, a young 30-year-old bachelor pastor comes to this church in this building, and he decides that he has something to say about the Fugitive Slave Act. I love this picture. We found it in the attic. We've since, photographed it and scanned it and, put it in Photoshop and everything to preserve it. But doesn't he look like a person who's not going to take a lot of back talk or a lot of, he's not going to be intimidated. He almost looks more military. In fact, I think this is not, I think he looks older than 30 here. I think this was taken when he was 42 and became a chaplain in the U.S. Army. Okay, so he preaches a sermon called A Discourse on the Recapture of Fugitive Slaves. In 1850, you can still buy it on Amazon or Goodreads or Book Oasis. Send them the request, they'll get it for you. And at the time that he is preaching, probably up in this same pulpit, I guess, Ken, I'm not sure if that's the same pulpit, it probably is, right, you think, in 1850? Because it was this building built in 1840. At the time he's preaching, there are two fugitives who have come up from Georgia, William and Ellen Craft. Do you know their story? Some of you may do. She was a very light-skinned African slave, and he was allowed to marry her, but lived on a different plantation, a different farm, and he had been hired out to work as a cabinet maker, very skilled. They got together and planned their escape. Why? They did not want to have children in Georgia. If they had children in Georgia and their owners went into debt, what did they do so many times when plantation owners would go into debt? Sell some slaves, right? Sell off the kids. So they were terrified of the thought of having children and losing them. So she dressed up as a white male planter, a southern gentleman who needed medical care, wrapped herself in bandages, had nice clothes, a top hat, and he was her accompanying slave. They got on the train, went from Macon, Georgia to Savannah, from Savannah to Charleston to Wilmington, Wilmington to Richmond, Richmond to Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, Baltimore to Philadelphia, a free state. Amazing story. So anyway, they are in Boston at this time. They've been here for 2 years. He's working as a cabinet maker. She's working as a seamstress. So Reverend William Whitcomb gets up on a cool November morning in the pulpit here and starts out with his sermon, and as many people would do in the custom, right, you start with the Bible text. Is that still the way some people preach, right, Ken? So he's chosen a text from the Old Testament. Thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which is escaped from his master unto thee. He shall dwell with thee even among you in that place which he shall choose, in one of thy gates, where it liketh him best. Thou shalt not oppress him. So we know that some people use the Bible to justify slavery, right? They say, well, there were slaves then, and even Israelis, children of Israel, Hebrews had slaves. Everyone had slaves in the old world. It's okay, no big deal. But Reverend Whitcomb knows the text he wants to bring up, so he brings that up. So he starts out, dear friends, will you believe me when I tell you that a law in favor of slave catching, of hunting and recapturing those in the northern states who have been so fortunate as to break loose from their southern imprisonment and assert the rights of manhood, a law to re-enslave those whom the providence of God and various human instrumentalities have helped to escape from cruel bondage. Sorry, I get out of breath. His sentences are very long. You can read the rest for yourself. But, right. Yeah, his sermons are amazing. I've read about 9 of his sermons at different times in his life. He's going right at him. You can see that. Just a quick note on Henry Box Brown came up from Virginia, or I'm not sure, maybe it's Virginia, but he had himself nailed in a box and shipped up to Philadelphia. This is him in later life, of course, when he's recovered. I don't know how he could stand because he had to crouch down. So anyway, to send a human back into a state of vassalage where the right of self-ownership, self-government, and all we hold dear will be ruthlessly and forever torn from him, and on and on. Here's a quote I really like, though, and it reminds me of Martin Luther King. fellow citizens and Christian friends, the new fugitive law, if carried out to its fullest extent, will enslave you and me as well as the black man. Amazing quote, isn't it? Why will it enslave us? Because it's enslaved us in our heads and hearts. Because we are enslaved to the principle that somehow some people don't deserve freedom. So it's an amazing quote. The inferior law must give way to the superior, very similar to Martin Luther King in his letter from Birmingham jail. God's law has to be dominant. If man's law goes against God's law, it cannot be binding. So there are many other wonderful quotes, and I made copies of passages from his sermon. And Ken has them. If you don't mind just passing a few out, you can take them home with you, because it's too long for us to spend time on it tonight. But you can get a sense of his passion and also the style of 19th century oratory, right? They're very, long sentences, but very passionate. If you can manage to say a whole paragraph without taking a breath, you'll be doing very well. But it'll give you a sense of kind of what he was bringing to this church. Here's a young 30-year-old bachelor again coming into a town that has been roiled and torn apart by the issue of slavery. And he's getting up there and he's telling it the way he believes it. So when finally they get to the end, and the sermon would have gone on for more than an hour. I've read through it, and I don't think I could read it in an hour.
Mine are not as good, but they're much shorter.
Yes, Ken's are much shorter. For the closing hymn, people stand and sing, "Oppression shall not always reign. There comes a brighter day when freedom burst from every chair shall have triumphant way. Then right shall over might prevail, and truth like hero armed and mail, the hosts of tyrant wrong assail and hold eternal sway." So I would love to have been in this church, this very building at that moment. It must have been electric, because he had them, he had people, he had captured them with the strength of his passion and oratory. And even though some people may have gone on opposing it, that was kind of a turning point for Stoneham, and Stoneham became known as an abolitionist town in the years following, when people would talk about the political movements that were going on. So, again, one of the great moments, I think, that I am personally very proud being a member of this church, but also just as a member of Stoneham, as someone who's lived in Stoneham for over 40 years, to be in a place where a man like that and the women like those who were here, the 27 women, the 14 women, who would not keep quiet and would press what they believed and stand up for human rights. So that's it for tonight. Thank you very much. Ken may have a few words to talk about our next one. This is what's coming next week. I'll let Ken take over.
Just want to invite you all back here for our final installment of our Lenten study series next week at 7 p.m. right here in this room. We are very happy to have the Reverend Darrell Goodwin, who is the leader of our denomination's conference here in southern New England. He'll be joining us and leading a conversation with me about current efforts of our denomination to enact racial justice, and what we can do as a community, what we can do as a nation as well. So I hope that you can come and participate in our conversation. And until then, I hope you have a wonderful week, and go in peace.